convinced that the art, entertainment, and reportage produced during this or any period served as a barometer of the times, illuminating the entire social milieu, not simply what was happening, which historians tell us about, but what people actually felt about what was happening, their sentiments and their relationships, their deepest feelings about their lives. This is what makes really good art such a vital form of historical documentation, even aside from the pleasure that it gives us. It's news that stays news, as Ezra Pound said. It's the proverbial gift that keeps giving. If historians and journalists show us the social landscape and give us the long view, art, even when described as fiction, gives us a peopled landscape, the intimate details that historians often leave out. The notion that artistic activity can actually be stimulated and not deadened by social crisis cuts against our standard view of the arts of the 20th century, in which most critics and readers usually see the 1920s as the great flowering of the arts, the shining moment, the dazzling era of modern experiment and innovation. And indeed, this was the time when America first developed an acknowledged world-class literature. This was with Hemingway and Faulkner and Fitzgerald in fiction, with T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost and Wallace Stevens. I'll give you a couple of images. This is Wallace Stevens, a poet. William Carlos Williams, another poet. Both of them only supported themselves with day jobs. Wallace Stevens worked for an insurance company in Hartford. William Carlos Williams worked at Patterson as a doctor all his life. They couldn't afford to support themselves writing poetry. These and half a dozen other exceptional poets. It was a time also, the 1920s I'm saying, was a time also for the emergence of great American classical composers, such as, and here on the right you'll see Aaron Copland, later with his protege Leonard Bernstein on the left. And to jump a few years ahead, this is one of the most famous shows that Aaron Copland wrote the music for. This was a ballet that he did with Martha Graham in the early 40s called Appalachian Spring. It was a time when such composers as Copland and Thompson, popular artists like Gershwin, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Cole Porter threw off the restraints of European models and gave their work a native coloring. Here's a very sybaritic image of Cole Porter in the 1920s, I believe. This was not a fashionable image in the 1930s, I guarantee you. In 20s literature, the intricate plots and elaborately furnished rooms of a realistic novel gave way to narratives so spare and suggestive, the Great Gatsby is an example, that they read like prose poetry. Now, in the hands of Eliot and his followers, poetry itself became a very difficult, very specialized art and lost its hold on the popular taste. In music, the schmaltzy tones of European operetta and the harmonic structure of concert music were replaced by the syncopated inflections of jazz and the dissonant sound, with its dissonant sound and African-American roots. There were new media that had never existed before, like motion pictures, whose very technology was intrinsically modern, even when it borrowed stories from traditional plays and novels. The last thing I want to do is to downplay the cutting-edge creativity of the 1920s, only with the conclusions that historians and critics have drawn from it. This is what they tell us. During the social crisis of the 1930s, the arts reverted or regressed to very accessible popular styles, realism in fiction and in the visual arts, populism in music, hackneyed rhythms and agitational messages in poetry, and so on. The art critic, Harold Rosenberg, who was later became a fierce partisan of post-war abstract art, wrote that, quote, formerly the 30s were a dropout, though there appeared an immense effusion of craft skill, not one new aesthetic idea emerged. Instead, he said the 30s were an interval in which history openly revealed its power to tamper with art. Well, why is that so unusual? History always tampers with art. From the point of view of someone who was a partisan of abstract art, this was an unfortunate event. From this angle, Writers, like photographers, were reduced to a kind of carbon copy art, either documenting the conditions of depression, sufferings endured by ordinary Americans, or producing escapist fluff, such as historical novels that took people's minds off their problems. This is the standard image of the Depression that we get from one of the most delightful movies ever done about the Depression later on. This is a movie from the mid-'80s by Woody Allen called The Purple Rose of Cairo, in which Mia Farrow, on the left, works as a waitress. Her husband, really a loud, is unemployed. Their life is drab and pinched, and she spends her afternoons at the local movie theater, seeking a touch of exotic romance, a story about anything but the actual world around her. She is handsomely rewarded when a dashing actor steps off the screen and finds his way into her life like a fantasy come alive. So working on Dancing in the Dark, I found this contrast between the gloomy, naturalistic work of so-called serious Depression artists and the Pollyannish fantasies of popular artists really untenable or overblown. What happened in this period was that the line between high art and popular art became blurred. High art, like journalism of the period, often dealt with the sufferings of ordinary people, such as the sharecropper families, in the great book by James Agee and the photographer Walker Evans called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. This is an image of one of those three families. Family of Bud Woods. A great photograph, one of the iconic photographs of the Depression era. One of the very special things about Walker Evans is that, unlike some of the other photographers who try to catch people unawares, he was very concerned with allowing his sitters to be something other than victims, to give them a certain dignity. And he had them pose for the camera. Sometimes he even had them pose in their Sunday best. And of course, you still see how threadbare their clothes and their lives are. You still see the desperation and marginal quality of their existence. So that's one side of Depression art. Popular entertainers, on the other hand, focus not on these ordinary or marginal people, but often on exceptional people, such as the idle rich. But the Depression was such a pervasive experience that it worked its way into both kinds of works. You take something, for example, like Busby Berkeley's famous musicals, like 42nd Street or Gold Diggers of 1933. There's not a line that doesn't refer, even a wisecrack, that doesn't refer in some way to the Depression. Now, Gold Diggers, perhaps the best of all these movies, begins with an image of showgirls clad only in large gold coins. This was before the censorship really kicked in. They're rehearsing a number, get this, for 1933, called We're in the Money. Oops. Well, there it is. There's We're in the Money. Busby Berkeley, as you can tell, had an extremely rich imagination. They are clad in these gold coins till the sheriff's men come and they close the show down for lack of money. They haven't paid their rent. And the director says, look, if we let us open tomorrow, we'll have the money to pay their rent. No, the show closes down. So We're in the Money becomes, of course, an extremely ironic title. Surprisingly, the movie ends with probably the most shocking number in the history of American musicals. It's a movie, it's a number which is a tribute to the veterans of World War I, now unemployed, and the women who suffer with them and lament their condition. It's called Remember My Forgotten Man, after the figure evoked by FDR in one of his 1932 campaign speeches. This, of course, was inspired by something that you might remember or have heard about, which was that of the famous bonus marchers. These were veterans of World War I who had been promised in the distant future that by 1945 they would receive a special bonus from the federal government. But by 1932 they were all out of work and starving.